The review for Dune is one that I've wanted to do for a while because I feel like my voice just needs to be added to the cacophony of people who are far more qualified to be reviewing things like this than I am. I'm sure that that is what everybody wants. One more person screaming his opinion into the void about this movie. Now, the discourse around Dune has actually been really positive. I'm not sure exactly what it is about Dune that inspires people to be more amicable, but for the most part, that is what I've seen is positive discourse. So I don't feel too bad about adding my voice to it because I do have some negative opinions about the movie. Don't hate me too much. I did enjoy it, I had a good time, and I will probably be rewatching this movie before the second one comes out in 5 or 6 years, but I just had some negative opinions about it that I wanted to share in addition to some of the positives. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive right into my review of Dune 2021, Part 1. Dune Part 1, 2021. If you somehow still do not know what Dune is about, here is just a quick summary without going into spoilers. Dune is set about 8,000 years in a, hopefully, alternate future. We follow the son of a duke as he is sent to the planet Arrakis to replace a baron at the spice refinery there. Spice being the substance that is used to make interstellar travel possible, therefore it is incredibly valuable. Think, I don't know, oil? When the Duke takes over the collection and refinement of the spice on Arrakis, he finds that a lot of the equipment has been sabotaged, presumably by the Baron, and that is what sets off all of the events in the story. Now, this is an extremely basic setup for Dune. It is a much more complex and interesting setting and story than this, but I want to make sure that I'm keeping it spoiler-free. This story has an entire magic system, a vast cast of characters and cultures and peoples and religions, and there's a lot more to it than just somebody takes over spice refinement and finds everything is sabotaged. You really kind of have to experience the movie. I don't want to get into spoilers or give away too much. Now we can dive into the review. When I review books, I always talk about the presentation, but the presentation does not contribute to the overall star rating of that book. However, for visual or audio media like movies and television shows, presentation is a huge part of that. And so how a film is presented to me, such as Dune, is going to have a star rating that ultimately impacts the overall rating. And in this case, Dune's presentation really works in its favor. It is the strongest aspect of this movie by far. This movie is both visually stunning and just the sound design is unparalleled. It is amazing. I don't think that there is anyone out there who would disagree with me when I give the presentation 5 stars, and that is absolutely what this film deserves. If I weren't doing a 5-star rating system, I would give it 10 or 12, I don't know. The presentation for this was pretty much flawless. I think if I watched it again, I might be able to find a couple of things that I didn't really like, but in the first watch through, every single scene was gorgeous. All of the sound worked perfectly with what was happening. The music was incredible, which we've come to expect from Hans Zimmer anyway, but this movie was visually and audibly stunning. It was perfect in that regard. I absolutely am so glad I saw this in a very nice theater, which is part of why I wanted to go and see it in a theater. From what I had heard and from what I had seen of the trailer, this is a movie that I really wanted to make sure I experienced in a top-notch theater. And that's also how I will suggest that anyone else experiences this movie. Make sure you see it in a top-notch theater. I know that it's available on HBO Max, but I cannot imagine experiencing this film in my home theater, even if I had a really nice one. Unless you have spent thousands upon thousands of dollars on your home theater, just go and see it in an actual theater if you are able to do so. It is an incredible experience. The cinematography told a story better than the dialogue did, but I'm going to get to that later on. 5 stars, absolutely, for the presentation of Dune. I don't think anybody is going to disagree with me on that one. At least I haven't seen anybody say that this movie was not visually stunning. Now I need to talk about the plot of Dune. If you don't know, Dune is based on a book that came out several decades ago. It was a science fiction book. Science fiction back then really struggled with things like characters and character development and even narrative as well. And Dune is not an exception to that. The characters are very bland in the book, and I'm going to talk more about the characters later when I review those. But overall, the plot of it is very cookie cutter and cut and dry. But part of that is also just because It's cookie cutter now, given the advancements that we've had and the number of books that have copied the likes of Dune. So it wasn't necessarily cookie cutter back then, and in fact, it might have even been considered incredibly original. But nowadays, the things that we see in Dune's story are extremely tropey and stuff that tends to be avoided. One of the key things is the Chosen One. Even though I know that Dune kind of subverts the Chosen One trope to some degree, it's still there and is still a key element of the story. And if it had been written today, I don't think Dune would have nearly as much success, because tropes like the ones that are present in Dune, and there are a lot of them, are just really easily dismissed these days, and we've seen them done 1,000 times. They're just not enjoyable anymore, and they're very predictable. This is a faithful adaptation of the book, and back then the book was not as tropey as we would consider it today, because the tropes in Dune weren't really tropes back when Dune was written. So I think that you have to look at the plot of Dune through the appropriate lens and say, this is a faithful film adaptation of a book that was not tropey when it was written, but is tropey now. And if you look at it through that lens, the plot really isn't as bad as it might seem at first glance. Thus, the plot of Dune is pretty solid when you look at it through the appropriate lens. I like the plot of Dune. I think it's pretty strong, and there are a lot of elements that I like. The film was faithful to the book in many regards. Themes of Dune were very well explored and defined in this story, which is really just a big setup for part 2. Even though part 1 had some cool elements and moments to it and was an enjoyable watch, it's really a lot of setup. That's why you see all sorts of jokes online about people saying that they realized Dune was just a trailer for a movie that's coming out later on. And yeah, that's a little bit true. I mean, you're looking at the first half of a book. I feel like the second one is going to be a lot stronger narrative-wise than the first one was, just based on the book. And because I know he's taking a few more liberties with the story in the second one than he did in the first part. While I don't want to detract too much from the plot of Dune just because of the time that it was written, I do have to point out something that I would point out if I were reviewing the book as well, and that is that the Chosen One trope is just unbelievably obnoxious to me. And I know I said that we have to look at it through the appropriate lens, but even then, I just cannot stand the Chosen One anything. If I were reviewing Harry Potter, I would knock off a bunch of stars for that. If I were reviewing anything else that has a Chosen One in it, especially things nowadays, but even older works when it wasn't necessarily tropey, it's just such a easy and lazy approach to telling a story. And yes, I know that the Chosen One trope is a little bit subverted in Dune, but it is still a very strong theme here, and I really don't like it as a center plot point. Now, this is an extremely subjective opinion, but for me, it's just, I hate it. I hate the Chosen One. It is one of my least favorite tropes. And that's going to cost stars for the plot of the story. It's going to detract stars not just from the film, but it would also detract them from the book if that's what I was reviewing, because I don't care when it was written. Chosen One is really just annoying and comes off as lazy for me. I will be detracting stars for that. I know that this is a faithful adaptation of the book, so he did what he could work with. He wasn't going to just completely rewrite the story, because we'd have a lot of angry people in that regard. I hate it. I hate Chosen One trope, and it's going to cost stars for the plot here. So I'm going to give Dune 4 stars as opposed to 5 in terms of plot. I like the plot of Dune, I like the story, and I appreciate the message that it's trying to convey. I just wish that it didn't have to use the Chosen One in order to do that. So let's talk about the world. I found the world of Dune to be pretty dry. Pretty dry. Seriously, I did. I found the world to be pretty bland and boring. This is a problem just with the book as well, and I know that it expands a little bit more later on and gets a little more interesting, and the world isn't really the focus of the story either. And there's some cool stuff in the world as well, and there are some interesting things present here, but ultimately that's not what the story is about. You have the very basic setup of it, and beyond that, you don't really need to know a whole lot. You need to know about Arrakis, you need to know about the spice, and you need to know that there's an emperor and some barons and dukes, and that's about all the information that you really need in order to understand the story, and that's what it gives to you. The magic system is interesting, but incredibly basic, and the weapons and shields are cool, but not anything that we haven't seen before, and not anything that just wows me and is outstanding in my opinion. It's all just stuff that I would expect to see in a science fiction story of this caliber. So nothing in the world necessarily stands out, because that's not really what the point of the story is. And again, the elements of the world being stuff that we've all seen before is really just a product of the time of the story of Dune and when it was written, but I can only suspend my criticism for time so much. In the end, I feel like the world of Dune and all that it encompasses is pretty average for me, which again is to be expected. It's not the real focus of the story here. I am glad they didn't make it extra robust or anything like that, but at the same time, the world just comes off as kind of dry. So I'm going to be giving the world of Dune an average rating of 3 stars. It was just average for me. Because the world of Dune is so simple, building it up for the reader or the viewer is not all that challenging an endeavor. And yet, I have to compliment masterful world building when I see it. And the world building in the Dune film was done extremely well. They established the important parts of this world really well. They did a great job with it. There was only one bit of exposition, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute. But beyond that, everything was just shown and not told, which I know is a lot easier to do in a movie than it is to do in something like a book. But there are so many movies and shows that do this terribly. So I know it's possible to do it poorly even when you have an easy way to convey it through show, not tell. So I have to give a lot of respect to the way the world was built here. In particular, I found the way that they presented the shields and how they function to be really well done. I noticed a couple of times when they really showed to the viewer, this is how the shields work. For example, having Paul hit his hand a few times to show the shield flashes red when it's hit, so that you know as the viewer, okay, every time I see a flash of red, it's because somebody got a hit in on the shield. Or later on, showing that the amount of pressure and the duration of the pressure applied to a certain point in the shield allows anything to pierce it over time if it tries hard enough and doesn't lose its momentum. We get information like this and nobody ever sits down and says, now Paul, here's exactly how shields work. I know you already know because you've used shields before and you've been training your whole life, but I'm gonna sit down and explain to you, also known as the viewer, exactly how shields work so that you know later on when you see them in action. Instead, we weren't sat down and told all this information. We were just shown it. We got the information that we needed very quickly and very effectively. And then we knew how shields worked. And that was the case for a lot of this. Although there were occasional bits of dialogue that were a little bit weak that kind of explained how certain things worked, but it all felt like information that the characters needed as well as the viewers, so there was never an as you know Bob moment, at least not that I remember. World building in Dune was superb and I want to give it 5 stars, but we opened up with narration, and I don't know if this is them trying to pay homage to the first movie or what, but the opening narration, as soon as it started, I kind of pulled back in my chair and went, oh no, no. And it was so unnecessary. It was just completely unnecessary. Everything in the narration could have just been shown, and in fact was being shown. The narration was pointless and just annoying, and I did not want it or appreciate it, and it was just frustrating, and it detracted from the excellent world building later on, and it detracted enough that I'm going to dock a star from the world building and give it 4 stars instead of 5. It was still excellent for the rest of the film, but that opening narration I'm so tired of that. Stop putting narration in the beginning of your movies and TV shows. I'm done with it. We don't need it. It's so frustrating, and I really hate that it's in Dune. Now it's time to talk about the characters. The characters of Dune suffer from something that many science fiction works in the 1900s or so suffer from, and that is being very one note and really just being present to serve a specific purpose. The characters are like saltines in chili. By that I mean they're not all that interesting on their own. The world makes them a little more vibrant, but in the end, they're just there to get the job done. If I were reviewing the book, I would give the characters 1 star. I'm sorry, I just would. The characters are not great in the book. And in the movie, the characters are still just not great, which is part of it being a faithful adaptation of the book, I suppose. But the performances that are given for these characters by these actors and actresses are incredible. They did a great job with what they were given. I was blown away by some of the performances that they had, and didn't make the characters themselves better characters or more well-rounded, but the performances gave them more life than any of their dialogue or personality, or lack thereof, was going to be able to. Timothée and Oscar and Rebecca and Jason all really gave it their all and brought something to the table that I personally didn't actually expect from the Dune movie, just knowing how bland the characters were in the book, but they really brought them to life in their own unique ways, and I really liked it. They did a great job, and they did their best with what they were given, and that's going to bump the star rating for the characters up a little bit. But that's not going to bump it up enough to give it an average rating, because while they did their best, the characters were still very bland and not all that interesting. They were really only interesting because of how great the performances were, so I'm going to give the characters of the Dune movie 2 stars. It's better than the 1 star I would give the book. Alright, just a couple more segments until I give my overall star rating for Dune Part 1. This next one is the writing, and writing for things like a film are a little challenging to really rate accurately because you're not really looking at anybody's prose, so you really have to go off of how they approached things like story beats and dialogue in particular. Dialogue is really where the writing is going to shine in this script, and the dialogue in Dune was pretty average for the most part. In some cases it was less so. It did what it needed to do and delivered the information, but once again, I'm really chalking a lot of the positivity in the dialogue up to the performances by the actors, not how well written it was. Some of the dialogue especially was just a little clunky and unnatural as well. Part of that is really just the fact that this is a faithful adaptation of the book, and so the characters are kind of bland, thus the dialogue is a little bland in some areas. And yet the performances, as I mentioned earlier, really brought some of the bland characters to life and breathed new life into them that probably wasn't really present in the dialogue itself. So it's a little hard to judge the writing here very accurately, especially just because I'm not reading the script myself. I don't have the script in hand. Overall, the writing here was just average in that regard. So I'm just going to go ahead and give it the average rating of 3 stars and move on. So now we have to talk about the pacing of Dune. This is one that I have seen the most mixed commentary on, and I completely understand where people are coming from when they complain about the Dune film's pacing. Dune is extremely slow and takes a long time to really get off the ground. But personally, I enjoyed that. I liked having the opportunity to bask in the world and the story and the visuals and the audio for such a long period of time. Dune is really slow for a decent chunk of its runtime. I totally understand why some people would sit in the theater and be bored by the movie, especially if they don't know what's happening or don't understand what's coming next. I can totally get why the pacing of Dune would be a sticking point for them, and I don't fault anyone who says that Dune was slow, because it was slow, but in my opinion, it needed to be slow for that first decent chunk. I don't see how you could have sped things up much more than they were and still told the story the way that it was told, which the story was told as decently as it could be. Maybe there could have been some sequences early on where things were sped up a little bit more, but I don't know. I don't personally have an issue with the pacing of Dune. I think that there were some times where some of the lulls later on went on for a while, or some scenes that were a bit slow went on for a little too long, but for the most part, the pacing for Dune was solid, and it made sense throughout the film why certain things were slow, and then we picked up with fast-paced action, usually for a decent chunk of time. So I don't really have a huge issue with the pacing. I will concur with what some people have said, that the beginning could have been sped up in some areas. If they'd done that, maybe it would have captivated people a little bit more in that first half of the movie, instead of having them kind of nearly falling asleep for it. I personally was not. But I definitely understand where they're coming from and feel like maybe there's something they could have done to speed things up a little bit in the beginning, maybe have a couple of sequences where things were a little bit more intense than they were. But that's really just me seeking to empathize with people who had that complaint about the pacing of Dune. I'm gonna give the pacing for Dune 4 stars. So my overall rating of Dune Part 1. This was an unforgettable spectacle of a movie. It was a lot of fun to watch. I loved the visuals and the sound. The cinematography as a whole is just incredible. They did an incredible job. I am really hopeful that the success of Dune will continue and will also inspire a rebirth of this genre, because sci-fi has, in my opinion, had quite a bit of a lull lately, and it's something that needs to be explored further. Dune, I'm hoping, will kind of kick off a new approach to beautiful and well-told sci-fi. And Dune sets a solid example of what those movies could look like and could sound like and could feel like. The feeling of seeing Dune in the theater and having like the rumble of surround sound as things like the voice are used was just unparalleled. It was absolutely amazing. So even though the visuals and the audio of Dune is absolutely a 5-star experience, and seeing it in theaters was a 5-star experience, there are so many pain points with the movie beyond the way that it looks and sounds that are going to drag that overall score down to a more average rating. In the end, I'm going to give Dune Part 1 3 stars out of 5. When I consider everything about my experience, not just how amazed I was at the visuals and the sound, I realize that in the end, it is a pretty average movie experience, and one that, while I will be watching it again, I'll really only be watching it again if it comes back in theaters before Part 2 comes out. Like, if there's a special screening or something, I will go and see it again in theaters. I'm not scrambling to watch it on HBO Max a second or third time. And I know some people who have watched it repeatedly on HBO Max, and good for them, but I don't really have an interest in watching it again unless I'm seeing it in a theater, and I don't really want to pay for another theater visit. I absolutely advise you that if you're gonna see this movie, go and see it in theaters. That, for me, is what made the experience worthwhile and so amazing, and I don't think that this is something that is meant to be experienced beyond that personally. It was built for a theatrical presentation, and that is where it is going to shine the most. Unless your home theater is just incredible, in which case, can I come over? The cinematography, the effects, the sound, everything that you're experiencing with Dune is really strong until it comes to the narrative, and that is when it becomes weak, and that is what's going to drag it down to that 3-star rating. For me, personally, my subjective opinion, this is a 3-star film. I hope this review didn't come across as too harsh. I do have a great deal of respect for the film as a whole, but I just really think that it's something that I'm only going to see in theaters this time and once more if it comes back into theaters before Part 2 is released. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out my review of Dune Part 1. I hope that you enjoyed it and appreciate my opinion, even if you don't agree with it. If you do or don't agree with it, I would love to hear from you. If there's something I got wrong, I'd like to hear that, because I don't like being wrong. It happens to me so rarely. If you would like to support me, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, like this video, and comment on it. All of these things help to boost my channel while I'm trying so hard to get it up off the ground, as I just began it here recently. Thank you very much for considering doing those things. And additionally, you can follow me on social media. I am at @TLBainter on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, with Instagram being where I am most active. In fact, for this month, I have been doing NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. That means that every day I have been posting an excerpt from what I am writing on my Instagram story. So if that interests you, and it is still November 2021, then I am most likely still doing that right now. So feel free to go and check that out if it's something that sounds interesting to you. I will be reviewing Metroid Dread next Wednesday, and then after that, on December 1st, I will be reviewing Iron Gold by Pierce Brown, getting back into reviewing books. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you next time. Bye.